I'm Major Sandra Chesterfield, 36, and I built my career from a small-town airport kid to an Air Force officer trusted with missions most people never hear about. For years, I put my father first, covering bills, showing up to every crisis, giving him more support than I ever admitted out loud. But the day he crossed a restricted line on a military tarmac and publicly dismissed my authority, something in me shifted. I made a decision that changed the course of our relationship for good. Ever been dismissed, underestimated, or embarrassed by someone you've bent over backwards for? If you have, share your story in the comments. You're in good company. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to draw a line after being pushed too far, hit like and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries, respect, and taking your power back. What happened afterward, even I didn't expect. I grew up watching planes take off from behind a chain-link fence, my father beside me with a thermos of coffee and grease, still under his fingernails from the morning shift. He worked aircraft maintenance at the civilian terminal, the kind of job where you clocked in before dawn and came home smelling like hydraulic fluid and jet fuel. I loved those evenings at the fence line. He'd point out the different models, explain why the landing gear retracted a certain way, tell me which crews were sloppy and which ones ran tight operations. He never flew, never wore a uniform, but he respected the machinery and the discipline behind it more than anyone I ever met. When my mother left during my sophomore year of high school, it became just the two of us. I started helping with bills when I could, picking up shifts at the grocery store, making sure he ate something other than gas station sandwiches. He didn't talk much about her leaving, just worked longer hours and came home quieter. I told myself I'd make him proud, that I'd do something that mattered. The Air Force Academy accepted me when I was 18. I still remember him bragging to his coworkers, voice loud enough to carry across the break room. "My kid's going to wear bars on her shoulders," he'd say, grinning like he'd won the lottery. The day I got commissioned as a second lieutenant, he sat in the audience with his good shirt on, the one he saved for funerals and weddings. When they pinned the gold bar on my uniform, I looked out and saw him wiping his eyes. Later he claimed it was just dust, but his voice cracked when he said it. I worked logistics and operations, the kind of assignments where you lived in spreadsheets and flight manifests, coordinating cargo movements and making sure aircraft got where they needed to be with the fuel and parts to keep them flying. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. I made first lieutenant 2 years later, then captain by my late 20s. My father called after every promotion, pride thick in his voice, asking when he could see the new rank insignia. I kept showing up for him. When he had surgery on his rotator cuff, I took leave and drove him to every appointment. When he got laid off during a contract dispute, I helped cover his rent for 3 months until he found another maintenance job. When his insurance wouldn't pay for a procedure he needed, I made up the difference from my officer pay. It wasn't a burden. He was my father. He'd raised me with structure and standards, taught me to show up early and do the work right. I owed him. But something started shifting as my career progressed. The pride he felt began to curdle into something else, something I didn't recognize at first. He'd make small comments during our phone calls, little jabs wrapped in humor. "You think you're too important to call your old man now," he'd say when I missed a Sunday check-in because of a duty weekend. Or he'd dismiss my work entirely. "It's just paperwork, right? How hard can it be?" I tried not to take it personally. I reminded myself he was getting older, that he'd spent his whole life on the outside of the world I now moved through. Maybe he just wanted to feel relevant. He started asking for favors I couldn't give. Base access for his friends who wanted to see the flight line. Special tours of hangars where active aircraft were staged. VIP treatment for events he had no clearance to attend. When I explained the regulations, the security protocols, the liability issues, he'd get defensive. "You're too by the book now," he'd say, voice tight. "You've forgotten where you came from." He joined a local veterans group, guys who'd served decades ago and now spent their afternoons at the VFW talking about how soft the military had gotten. They told him officers were pampered, that the real work happened on the enlisted side, that anyone with a degree and decent test scores could get a commission. He started repeating their talking points. "You push emails," he said once, voice flat. I broke my back on the ramp. It stung more than I wanted to admit. I deployed twice, managed operations in environments where one mistake could cost lives, worked 16-hour days coordinating airlift missions that kept supply lines open. But he didn't see that. He saw someone in an office, someone who'd moved beyond him. He started rewriting history, small revisions at first, then bigger ones. He'd tell people he got me into the academy, that he taught me everything I knew about discipline and aircraft. He'd claim my success as his own, like I was an extension of his career instead of someone who'd built her own. I noticed how he introduced me at gatherings. My daughter, the Air Force officer, he'd say, voice swelling with ownership. Not pride. Ownership. I tried to be patient. I reminded myself that parents sometimes struggled when their children surpassed them, that his identity had been built on being the one who knew about planes, about the right way to do things. Now I was the one with authority, with access, with a career that opened doors he'd only ever watched from the outside. But the disrespect grew sharper. He dismissed my responsibilities, downplayed my achievements, made it clear he thought my rank was something given, not earned. And slowly, painfully, I started to realize that he loved the idea of my career more than he respected the reality of it. He loved telling people his daughter was an officer. He just didn't like that I had become someone he couldn't control. The breaking point came during a base family day, an event designed to let service members show their loved ones a controlled glimpse of military life. I was a captain by then, supervising a logistics team of 15 airmen, responsible for coordinating operations that kept cargo moving across 3 time zones. I'd invited my father, hoping it might rebuild some of the connection that had frayed over the past few years. Maybe if he saw what I actually did, saw the people who depended on me, he'd understand. The day started well enough. I gave him a tour of the operations center, introduced him to my team, let him sit in on a brief where we walked through the week's airlift schedule. He nodded along, asked a few questions, seemed genuinely interested. For a moment, I thought maybe we'd turned a corner. Then we walked outside toward the static display area, where families could get close to aircraft that had been positioned for photos and demonstrations. The flight line beyond was clearly marked as restricted, red cones and signage indicating that only authorized personnel could cross. My father saw the boundary and kept walking. I called after him. "Dad, you need to stay on this side." He waved me off without turning around. "I just want a closer look." Security noticed immediately. 2 airmen moved to intercept, polite but firm. "Sir, this area is restricted. You'll need to step back behind the line." My father stopped, turned, and his face flushed red. "Do you know who my daughter is?" he said, voice rising. "She's a captain. She outranks both of you." I felt my stomach drop. My team was 10 feet away, watching. Other families had turned to see what the commotion was about. I stepped forward quickly, trying to de-escalate before it became a scene. "Dad, they're doing their job. Let's just step back and He cut me off. "Tell them who you are," he said, eyes locked on mine. "Tell them you're in charge here." I kept my voice calm, professional. "The rules apply to everyone, including me." His expression shifted, something between disbelief and anger. "You're really going to let them talk to me like this?" The security airmen looked uncomfortable but held their ground. I could see my senior master sergeant watching from the operations tent, assessing whether she needed to intervene. I pulled my father aside, away from the crowd, trying to handle it privately. "You can't just walk onto a restricted flight line," I said quietly. "It doesn't matter whose family you are. Those rules keep people safe." He stared at me like I'd betrayed him. "You should have told them to back off. You should have made this easier." I felt something crack inside me, something that had been bending for years. "I don't make things easier by ignoring regulations. That's not how this works." His voice dropped, but the anger sharpened. "You've changed," he said. "You've forgotten what matters." Then, loud enough for the airmen nearby to hear, he added, "You're a disappointment." The words hung in the air. I saw my team exchange glances, saw the families pretending not to listen. I felt the heat rise in my face, the humiliation of being dressed down by my own father in front of people I led. But I didn't respond. I didn't defend myself, didn't argue. I just stood there, letting the moment pass, waiting for him to finish. He refused to apologize afterward. On the drive back to his house, he sat in silence, arms crossed, staring out the window. When I dropped him off, he said, "You chose the uniform over family. I hope it was worth it." I didn't hear from him for 3 months. I deployed twice in the next 2 years, focused on my work, threw myself into the operations that demanded my full attention. When the promotion board selected me for major, I didn't tell him right away. I wasn't sure I wanted to share it. The relationship had fractured, held together only by obligation and old affection that felt more like memory than reality. I kept paying his bills when he needed help, kept answering when he called about VA paperwork or insurance claims. But the emotional distance grew wider, a gulf neither of us knew how to cross. And part of me wondered if it ever would. I started thinking more carefully about what had happened between us, trying to understand how we'd gotten here. A mentor of mine, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hall, noticed I was distracted during a planning session one afternoon. He pulled me aside after the brief and asked if I wanted to talk. We sat in his office, and I told him about my father, about the slow erosion of our relationship, about the family day incident that still made my chest tighten when I thought about it. Marcus listened without interrupting, the way good leaders do. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Parents sometimes resent the growth they can't follow. It's not about you. It's about what you represent to him now." I thought about that for a long time. My father had spent his whole life on the periphery of aviation, maintaining aircraft but never flying them, working beside people in uniform but never wearing one himself. And now I'd stepped into a world he'd only ever observed from behind fences and security checkpoints. I'd become someone with authority he couldn't access, someone whose rank carried weight he couldn't replicate. Maybe it wasn't that he didn't love me. Maybe it was that he loved the version of me who still needed him more than I loved the version I'd become. I started setting boundaries. I stopped doing favors that bent regulations. I stopped making excuses for his behavior when he showed up on base and expected special treatment. I stopped answering every phone call immediately, stopped rearranging my schedule every time he decided he needed something. It felt cold at first, like I was pulling away from someone who'd raised me, who'd sacrificed for me. But I also recognized that I'd been sacrificing too, for years, without reciprocity. I'd covered his bills, taken leave for his appointments, spent weekends helping him navigate bureaucracy and paperwork. I'd given him access to a world he wanted to be part of, introduced him to people I worked with, brought him onto bases where he could feel important. And in return, he'd minimized my work, dismissed my rank, and treated my authority as a tool for his pride rather than something I'd earned through years of service. I examined the dynamic honestly. I'd been trying to prove something to him, trying to make him see me as competent, as someone who'd made him proud. But he didn't want to see me as competent. He wanted to see me as someone whose success reflected his guidance, his influence, his legacy. When that illusion broke, when it became clear I'd built a career independent of him, he couldn't reconcile it. A colleague of mine, Captain Jenna Brooks, had gone through something similar with her own family. We talked one night over coffee in the commissary, and she said something that stuck with me: people can love you and still resent what you've become. It doesn't make the love less real. It just makes the relationship more complicated. I was in my mid-30s now, a newly promoted major, responsible for operations that moved cargo and personnel across continents. I coordinated with joint commands, managed budgets in the millions, oversaw airmen whose careers depended on my decisions. I'd earned the respect of people who outranked me and the trust of people I led. But I still couldn't earn my father's respect, not in the way that mattered. I kept showing up for him when it was necessary. When he had a health scare, I took emergency leave and spent a week making sure he had the care he needed. When his housing situation became unstable, I helped him find a new place and covered the deposit. When he couldn't navigate the VA system, I made the calls and filed the paperwork. But I stopped expecting gratitude. I stopped expecting him to see me clearly. I accepted that our relationship had become functional, not emotional. I fulfilled my obligations as his daughter, but I stopped trying to be the daughter he wanted me to be. And in that acceptance, I found a kind of peace. It wasn't the relationship I'd hoped for, but it was the one we had. and I stopped pretending it could be anything else. The invitation was my idea, a last attempt to bridge the gap that had widened into something I wasn't sure we could cross. My father's birthday was coming up, and I thought maybe a base tour, something structured and official, might give us neutral ground to reconnect. I cleared it through the appropriate channels, arranged for a visitor pass, and picked him up early on a Saturday morning. The first few hours went smoothly. I showed him the operations center again, walked him through the cargo staging areas, let him watch a briefing on airlift coordination. He asked questions, seemed engaged, even made a few jokes that felt like the father I remembered. I started to think maybe I'd been too hard on him, too quick to write off the possibility of repair. We took a shuttle toward the airfield perimeter, where a few aircraft were parked for maintenance and inspection. The plan was to loop past the static displays and head back to the visitor center for lunch. But as we drove past a restricted section of the tarmac, my father went still. I followed his gaze and saw it, a VC-25A, the modified Boeing 747 that serves as Air Force One when the president is aboard. It was parked in a secure holding area, surrounded by barriers and security personnel, undergoing what looked like scheduled maintenance between flights. My father stared at it like he'd seen something holy. "That's Air Force One," he said, voice quiet, almost reverent. I nodded. "It's here for a maintenance check. We're not cleared to get any closer." He didn't respond. He just kept staring, and I saw something shift in his expression, a kind of desperate nostalgia mixed with something harder, something I didn't immediately recognize. The shuttle stopped near the visitor pathway, a clearly marked route that kept civilians away from active operations. My father stepped off and started walking. Not toward the pathway. Toward the aircraft. I called after him. "Dad, you need to stay on the marked route." He waved me off without looking back. "I just want a closer look. I worked on these kinds of planes my whole life." I followed, keeping my voice calm but firm. "It's a restricted zone. You can't go past the barriers." He ignored me, moving faster now, past the warning signs, past the cones that marked the security perimeter. I saw the guards notice, saw them step out from their positions near the aircraft. My father was still walking, heading straight for the fuselage, like he had every right to be there. I moved to intercept, but he turned and snapped at me. "Relax. I just want a picture. I brought you here, remember? I'm the reason you even know what these planes are." The guards were closer now, hands near their sidearms, eyes locked on my father. I saw the moment he realized how serious this was, saw the fear flash across his face. And then he yelled, voice cracking with panic. "That's Air Force One. They'll shoot you. Come back." But the guards weren't aiming at me. They'd already scanned my badge, seen my uniform, recognized the clearance level that gave me access to areas my father couldn't imagine. One of them spoke into his radio, and a moment later, the access stairs at the rear of the aircraft began to lower. I stood frozen, disbelief washing over me, as the pilot appeared at the top of the stairs. He was a lieutenant colonel, probably close to my age, and he gave me a crisp salute. "Ready for takeoff, ma'am." The moment felt surreal, like something out of a dream I couldn't quite wake from. My father stood 15 feet away, staring, his face pale, his mouth half open. For the first time in years, maybe in his whole life, he understood the world I actually lived in. Not the world he imagined, where my rank was symbolic, where my authority was something he could borrow or diminish. The real world, where I had clearance to board the most secure aircraft in the United States Air Force, where pilots saluted me, where guards lowered stairs instead of drawing weapons. I turned to the pilot and shook my head slightly. "Not today, sir. Just escorting a visitor." He nodded, professional, and the stairs retracted. The guards stepped back, but they kept watching my father, waiting to see what I'd do. I walked over to him slowly, and he looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "I didn't know," he said, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't say anything. I just gestured toward the shuttle, and he followed, silent and shaken, the fight gone out of him completely. The security team escorted my father back to the safe zone for questioning, standard procedure for anyone who breached a restricted perimeter. I stood nearby but didn't intervene. I didn't soften the consequences, didn't pull rank to make it easier. I let the system work the way it was designed to work. For once, I didn't shield him. They asked him basic questions: why he'd crossed the barrier, whether he understood the signage, if he'd been briefed on the security protocols. He answered quietly, his earlier bravado completely gone. He kept glancing at me, waiting for me to step in, to smooth things over the way I always had. I didn't. When they finished, they issued him a warning and updated his visitor status to require direct escort for any future base access. It wasn't a criminal charge, but it was a mark on his record, a permanent note that he'd violated security protocols. He was shaken when we left, his hands trembling slightly as he climbed back into my vehicle. On the drive back, he tried to laugh it off. That was something, huh? Got a little carried away. His voice cracked halfway through, betraying the fear still coursing through him. I didn't coddle him. I kept my eyes on the road and said, "You crossed into a restricted area around the most secure aircraft in the Air Force. You're lucky they recognized my clearance, or that situation could have ended very differently." He went quiet. We drove the rest of the way in silence. When I dropped him at his house, he hesitated before getting out. "I didn't know it was that serious," he said. I looked at him directly. "You've never taken any of this seriously. That's the problem." He flinched, but didn't argue. Over the next few weeks, something shifted. He called less often, and when he did, his tone was different. Quieter. More careful. He asked about my work, actually listened to the answers, didn't interrupt with stories about his own experience or dismissive comments about paperwork and emails. He started asking questions respectfully, like he was trying to understand rather than compete. His veteran friends apparently heard a sanitized version of the Tarmac incident, enough to know he'd crossed a line and gotten himself in trouble. He stopped bragging about me at their gatherings, stopped trying to claim my achievements as reflections of his guidance. The entitlement that had colored every interaction for years began to fade. One evening, he called and said, "I've been thinking about what happened. About a lot of things, really." I waited, letting him find the words. "I didn't see you clearly," he said. "I thought I did, but I didn't. I thought your rank was just a title, something that looked good but didn't mean much. I didn't understand the weight of it. The responsibility. What you actually do every day." I didn't fill the silence. I let him sit with it. "I was proud of you," he continued, "but I was proud of the wrong things. I liked telling people you were an officer. I liked the idea of it. But I didn't respect what it actually meant. And I'm sorry for that. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't undo years of dismissiveness and boundary violations. But it was sincere, and that mattered." "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. "It means something." The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Old habits surfaced occasionally, moments where he started to slip back into entitlement or resentment. But he caught himself more often now, corrected course, asked instead of demanded. He started treating me with something that felt like reverence, not because of the uniform, but because he'd finally seen the person wearing it. He'd underestimated me for years, minimized my work, competed with my success. And it took a moment of real consequence, a confrontation with the reality of my authority, for him to understand what he'd been dismissing. I didn't gloat. I didn't remind him of all the times he'd been wrong. I just accepted the change and moved forward, cautiously hopeful that maybe we could build something better than what we'd had. I didn't rush to forgive, and I didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. Trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild itself just because someone apologizes. It requires consistent action over time, proof that the change is real and not just a temporary reaction to being embarrassed. I structured our contact differently. Shorter visits, clearer boundaries, expectations set in advance. I stopped making myself available for every crisis or inconvenience. I stopped rearranging my life to accommodate his schedule. If he needed help, I helped, but on terms that worked for both of us, not just him. He noticed the difference. At first, I think he expected things to go back to normal once enough time had passed, once the sting of the Tarmac incident faded. But I held firm, and slowly he adjusted. He started earning back trust in small ways. He fixed things around my house when I was deployed, not because I asked, but because he wanted to contribute. He asked about my missions, actually engaged with the details instead of glazing over or redirecting to his own stories. He respected my schedule, stopped calling at inconvenient times, and then getting offended when I didn't answer immediately. One evening, about 6 months after the incident, he came over for dinner. We were sitting on the back porch, the kind of quiet moment that used to feel tense, but now just felt calm. He set down his drink and said, "I didn't see you clearly." "I do now." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accompanied by tears or grand gestures. It was just a statement of fact, delivered with a kind of straightforward honesty that felt more meaningful than anything rehearsed. I accepted the apology without romanticizing it. I didn't tell him everything was fine, that we were back to the way things used to be. Because we weren't, and we wouldn't be. But we could be something different, something more honest. Our relationship became simpler. We talked about practical things, shared updates on our lives, spent time together without the weight of unspoken resentment hanging over every interaction. He stopped trying to claim ownership of my success and started treating it as something separate from him, something I'd built on my own. He stopped expecting special treatment because of our relationship and started understanding that my rank came with responsibilities that didn't bend for family convenience. I let him back into my life, but on new terms. I didn't need him to be perfect. I just needed him to be honest, to respect the boundaries I'd set, to treat me like an adult with my own authority instead of an extension of his identity. And slowly, carefully, he learned how to do that. The trust we rebuilt wasn't the same as what we'd had when I was young. It was more fragile, more conditional, built on awareness rather than assumption. But it was real, and it was enough. Years passed, and the rhythms of military life continued. I performed at a high level, managed complex operations, earned the respect of commanders and subordinates alike. The promotion board selected me for lieutenant colonel, and this time I told my father. His response was simple: "You earned that." No claims of credit, no stories about how he'd prepared me for this. Just acknowledgement. He aged, as people do, but something else happened too. He softened. The hard edges of entitlement and resentment that had defined him for so long began to smooth out. It was like watching someone go through a second adolescence in reverse, shedding the insecurity and defensiveness that had calcified over decades. He became what I'd always needed him to be, a quiet supporter. Someone who understood my world without needing to own a piece of it. He stopped showing up on base expecting access or favors. He stopped trying to impress his friends with stories about his daughter, the officer. He stopped treating my rank as something that reflected on him. Instead, he just listened. He asked good questions. He told me he was proud in ways that felt genuine instead of performative. The Tarmac incident became a marker between us, something we didn't joke about but both remembered. It represented the moment when illusion shattered and reality took its place, when he finally understood that my authority wasn't symbolic or borrowed. It was earned through years of service, through deployments and decisions, and the weight of responsibility I carried every day. I reflected on what I'd learned through all of it. Boundaries, enforced calmly and consistently, can save relationships. They create space for honesty instead of resentment, for respect instead of obligation. I'd spent years trying to be the daughter he wanted, trying to make him proud while also trying to prove I deserved the rank I wore. I'd let his opinions carry too much weight, let his approval matter too much. When I stopped doing that, when I started living according to my own standards instead of his expectations, the relationship became healthier. I also recognized the difference between being a child trying to impress a parent and being an adult who commands aircraft, airmen, and national assets. That shift in self-perception changed everything. I didn't need his validation anymore. I had the validation of every superior who'd endorsed my promotions, every subordinate who'd trusted my leadership, every mission I'd completed successfully. His respect was something I wanted, but it wasn't something I required to know my own worth. My father, for his part, seemed to understand that finally. He stopped competing with my success and started celebrating it. He stopped trying to diminish my work and started asking how he could support it. He became someone I could rely on in small ways, someone who showed up when it mattered without demanding recognition. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. Some damage can't be fully repaired, some trust can't be completely restored. But it was real progress, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than obligation and unspoken resentment. And that was enough. The final lesson, the one that stayed with me through everything, was this: respect doesn't come from shouting warnings on a tarmac. It doesn't come from claiming credit for someone else's achievements. It doesn't come from rank or proximity to power. It comes from finally seeing someone for who they are, not who you need them to be. It comes from acknowledging what they've earned, what they've built, what they've become through their own effort and sacrifice. My father saw me clearly, finally, after years of looking past me or through me or at some version of me that existed only in his imagination. And when he saw me, really saw me, he understood that I'd become someone who commanded respect not because of him, but in spite of the obstacles he'd created. I was Major Sandra Chesterfield, an officer in the United States Air Force, responsible for operations that kept aircraft flying and missions succeeding. I wore the rank I'd earned through 16 years of service, through deployments and decisions and the daily work of leadership. And the quiet satisfaction I carried, the thing that sustained me through every challenge, was knowing that I'd built this myself. The day my father yelled that they'd shoot me, that I needed to come back, he was operating from fear and misunderstanding. He thought I was in danger because he didn't understand the world I lived in. But when those guards lowered the stairs and the pilot saluted, he learned something that changed him forever: real leaders don't need to shout. Real authority doesn't demand recognition. Real respect is given freely to those who've earned it, by people who understand what it represents. And I had earned every bit of mine. 30 years is a long time in anyone's life, but in military service, it's practically a lifetime. I'm 66 now, retired with the rank of Major General, 2 stars that I wore for the final 8 years of my career before I hung up the uniform for good. My father is 94, living in an assisted care facility about 20 minutes from my house, the same house I bought after my last posting at the Pentagon. The place is nice, nicer than I thought we'd be able to afford before I realized how much I'd saved over 3 decades of deployments and temporary duty assignments where there was nothing to spend money on anyway. He has a small apartment with a kitchenette he barely uses, a recliner positioned in front of a window that overlooks a courtyard where residents sit and feed birds, and walls covered with photographs. Most of them are of aircraft, vintage prints he collected over the years, but there's a whole section dedicated to my career. Not the early photos where he used to brag about me to anyone who'd listen, but the later ones, the ones that meant something different. There's a picture from my promotion to Lieutenant Colonel, both of us standing together, his hand on my shoulder, his expression quiet and proud in a way that felt genuine. There's one from my change of command ceremony when I took over an entire logistics wing, him sitting in the front row in a suit that actually fit, hands folded in his lap, watching with something that looked like awe. And there's my favorite, taken candidly during a retirement ceremony for one of my mentors, Lieutenant Colonel Hall, the man who'd helped me understand what was happening between my father and me all those years ago. In the photo, my father and I are sitting next to each other, both of us laughing at something, the kind of unguarded moment that only happens when people are genuinely comfortable together. I visit him twice a week, more if my schedule allows. Today is Thursday, which means I'll bring lunch from the Italian place he likes, the one that makes lasagna the way he remembers his mother making it, heavy on the ricotta and with enough garlic to clear a room. I pick up the order on my way, the smell filling my car, reminding me of Sunday dinners when I was young, before everything got complicated, before rank and resentment created distance between us. When I arrive, he's already waiting in the common area, dressed in the flannel shirt I bought him for Christmas and the Air Force veteran cap he wears everywhere now. He's smaller than he used to be, age shrinking him in ways that still surprise me sometimes, but his eyes are still sharp, still that same pale blue that could either twinkle with humor or harden with stubbornness, depending on his mood. "You're late," he says, but he's grinning, the tease obvious. "Traffic," I reply, setting the bag on the table. "You want to eat here or in your apartment?" "Here's fine. More entertainment." He gestures toward a table near the window where 2 other residents are arguing about a crossword puzzle, their voices carrying across the room. We settle in, and I unpack the containers, setting his portion in front of him along with a napkin and the plastic utensils the restaurant included. He looks at the lasagna like it's a gift, which I suppose it is, and digs in without waiting. We eat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. This is new, this ease between us, something that took decades to build. After the Tarmac incident, after the slow rebuilding of trust, after years of learning how to be in each other's lives without conflict, we eventually found this. Not the relationship we had when I was young, but something better, something more honest. "How's the book coming?" he asks between bites. "I've been working on a memoir, nothing fancy, just my reflections on a career in the Air Force, the lessons I learned, the people who shaped me. My publisher thinks it'll do well, that there's an audience for stories about women in military leadership, especially now when the services are pushing for more diversity in the officer corps. I'm not so sure, but writing it has been therapeutic, a way to process everything that happened, everything I lived through." Slowly, I admit. I'm stuck on the chapter about early command experiences, trying to figure out how to talk about the challenges without making it sound like I'm complaining. He nods thoughtfully. "You were never much for complaining, even when you should have been." It's true. I learned early to keep problems to myself, to project competence even when I was drowning, to never let anyone see me struggle. It made me a good officer but a guarded person, something I've been working on in retirement. I'm trying to be more honest in the book, I say. Talk about the times I screwed up, the decisions I'd make differently now. Make it real instead of polished. "Good," he says. "People need real. They get enough polished." We finish eating, and I clean up the containers while he watches the crossword puzzle argument escalate into good-natured bickering. When I sit back down, he looks at me with an expression I've come to recognize, the one that means he's been thinking about something and finally worked up the nerve to say it. "I've been going through some old boxes," he starts. "Found some things I thought you might want." This is new too, this acknowledgement that he's mortal, that there will come a time when I'll be sorting through his belongings after he's gone. He's been preparing for it in small ways, giving me things that matter, telling me stories I'll need to remember when he's not around to tell them anymore. "What kind of things?" I ask. "Letters mostly. Ones I wrote to you when you were at the academy, ones you sent back. Thought you might want them for the book, or just to have." I feel something tighten in my chest. I remember those letters, the lifeline we maintained during my first years away from home. His were full of advice and updates about his work, awkward attempts to stay connected across a distance he didn't quite understand. Mine were full of details about classes and training, my attempts to share a world he wasn't part of but desperately wanted to understand. "I'd like that," I say quietly. He nods, satisfied. "There's something else too. Something I've been meaning to give you for a long time." He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small box, the kind that might hold a piece of jewelry. He slides it across the table, and I open it carefully. Inside is a pin, old and tarnished, the kind aircraft maintenance crews used to wear decades ago. It has wings and a wrench crossed beneath them, a symbol of the work he did for 35 years. "That was my first crew pin," he says. "Got it when I finished my certification, back before you were born. I've kept it all these years, thought maybe you'd want it now." I pick it up carefully, feeling the weight of it, the history embedded in the metal. "Dad, this is yours. You should keep it." He shakes his head. "I want you to have it. You're the one who flew, who made it mean something. I just fixed the planes. You commanded them." It's a small moment, but it carries the weight of everything we've been through. This man who once resented my success, who competed with my achievements, who couldn't understand the world I'd entered, is now freely giving me the symbol of his own legacy, acknowledging that mine surpassed his in ways he's finally at peace with. "Thank you," I say, and I mean it for more than just the pin. We sit together for another hour, talking about small things, easy things. He tells me about the new resident who moved in last week, a former Marine who served in Vietnam and has strong opinions about everything. I tell him about my garden, the tomatoes that are finally ripening, the squirrels that keep raiding my bird feeders. It's mundane and perfect, the kind of conversation we never could have had when I was younger, when every interaction was loaded with unspoken tension and unmet expectations. When I get ready to leave, he walks me to the door, moving slowly but steadily, refusing the cane his doctor says he should use. "Same time next week?" he asks. "Same time," I confirm. He hugs me, something he does now without awkwardness, without the stiffness that used to make physical affection feel obligatory. "I'm proud of you," he says, voice quiet but steady. "I know I didn't always show it the right way, but I am. I always was." "I know, Dad. And I do." I understand now that his pride was always there, just tangled up with fear and insecurity and the limitations of his own emotional vocabulary. It took him decades to learn how to express it in ways that didn't hurt, but he got there eventually. We both did. The drive home takes me through the part of town where I grew up, past the old airport where my father used to work. The facility has been renovated since then, expanded and modernized, but I can still see the fence line where we used to sit together, watching planes take off into pink-streaked sunsets. I pull over for a moment, park along the side of the road, and just look. It's strange how places hold memory, how a stretch of chain-link fence can contain an entire relationship's worth of meaning. That fence represented everything my father loved and everything he couldn't have. He worked on the other side of it, kept aircraft running, ensured safety protocols were followed, but he never got to experience what it felt like to board those planes, to command them, to move through the world with the authority he spent his life supporting from the ground. When I crossed that fence, metaphorically speaking, when I entered a world he could only observe, it broke something in him. He couldn't reconcile the daughter who used to sit beside him, asking questions and absorbing his knowledge, with the officer who outranked people he saw as authority figures, who had access to spaces he'd never enter, who'd built a career that dwarfed his own in scope and recognition. It took the Tarmac incident, that moment of raw confrontation with reality, for him to finally understand. And it took years after that for him to accept it, to make peace with it, to transform his pride from something possessive into something generous. I think about the pin in my pocket, the small piece of metal that represents his life's work, now passed to me as a symbol of continuity rather than competition. It means more to me than any medal I've earned, any promotion I've received. It means he finally sees me clearly and isn't threatened by what he sees. My phone buzzes with a text from my daughter, Alexis, asking if I'm still coming to dinner on Sunday. She's 32, a civilian software engineer with no interest in military service, living in Seattle with her husband and my 2 grandchildren. I text back confirmation, add a heart emoji that she'll probably tease me about later, and pull back onto the road. Alexis never knew the complicated version of her grandfather. By the time she was old enough to form memories, he'd already transformed into the gentle, supportive man he is now. She grew up with bedtime stories about the planes he used to fix, with a grandfather who attended every school play and soccer game, who taught her to ride a bike and never once made her feel like she needed to prove anything. Sometimes I envy her that uncomplicated relationship. But mostly I'm grateful she got to know him at his best, that she didn't have to navigate the minefield I did, that the lessons he learned from our struggles meant her experience could be different. That's the thing about transformation. It's not just for the people who change. It ripples outward, affects everyone in proximity, creates new possibilities for relationships that might have repeated the same painful patterns. My father broke a cycle with me, and in doing so, he gave Alexis something I never had, a grandfather who celebrated her achievements without needing to own them, who supported her choices without trying to control them, who loved her without conditions or complications. When I get home, I find myself pulling out old photo albums, something I don't do often but feel compelled to do now. I flip through images of my career, commissioning ceremony, first duty station, deployment photos from places I'm still not supposed to talk about in detail, promotion ceremonies that marked milestones I wasn't always sure I'd reach. In the early photos, my father appears occasionally, usually standing stiff and formal, like he's not quite sure how to position himself in my world. But in the later ones, especially after I made major and then lieutenant colonel, something shifts. He's more relaxed, more present, more genuinely engaged. There's a photo from my promotion to colonel that stops me. I'm in dress blues, my father standing beside me, both of us looking at the camera with expressions that mirror each other. I can see the family resemblance in that photo more clearly than I ever have before. The same shape of the eyes, the same set of the jaw, the same slight smile that suggests we're both thinking something we're not saying. I remember that day vividly. It was 13 years after the Tarmac incident, long enough that we'd rebuilt our relationship into something solid, something that could withstand the weight of ceremony and pride. He'd traveled to the ceremony with Alexis, who was 19 at the time, and I remember watching him interact with the other attendees, with the officers who came to congratulate me. He was gracious and humble, introducing himself as Sandra's father, without any of the posturing that used to accompany those words. When someone thanked him for my service, implying he deserved credit for raising me, he'd smiled and said, "She did this herself. I'm just lucky I get to watch." That moment, more than any apology or explicit conversation, told me the change was complete. He'd let go of the need to claim ownership, accepted his role as witness rather than architect, and found peace in that distinction. The phone rings, interrupting my trip down memory lane. It's my former chief of staff, Captain Dana Ruiz, now retired herself and running a consulting firm that helps veterans transition to civilian careers. We've stayed close over the years, meeting for coffee once a month, sharing the particular understanding that comes from having navigated the same world. "How's the general doing?" she asks, still using my rank even though I've been retired for 8 years. "Surviving retirement," I reply. "You know how it is. Too much time to think, not enough structure to prevent the thinking." She laughs. "That's why I started the business. Couldn't stand sitting still." "Listen, I'm calling because we're putting together a panel for a leadership conference next month, specifically about mentorship and family dynamics in military service. Thought you might be interested in participating." I hesitate. I've done a few of these over the years, usually talking about logistics management or joint operations, topics that feel safe and professional. But family dynamics hits closer to home, requires a level of vulnerability I'm not always comfortable with in public settings. "What would you want me to talk about?" I ask. "Your experience," Dana says simply. "How you navigated having a complicated relationship with your father while building a career. How you set boundaries. How you transformed that relationship over time." I think a lot of service members struggle with this, especially women, and they need to hear from someone who's been through it. I think about the book I'm writing, the chapter I'm stuck on, the question of how honest to be. Maybe this is an opportunity to practice that honesty in a smaller setting, to test whether my story resonates with people or just sounds like self-indulgent reflection. "Okay," I say. "Send me the details." I'll do it. We chat for a few more minutes, catching up on mutual friends and trading stories about our respective grandchildren. When we hang up, I feel energized in a way I haven't in months. Retirement is comfortable, but it can also be stagnant. The opportunity to contribute something meaningful, to help younger service members avoid some of the mistakes I made or navigate some of the challenges I faced, reminds me that my experience has value beyond my own life. That evening, I sit down at my desk and open the document where I've been working on the memoir. The chapter I've been stuck on is titled Early Command: Lessons in Authority and Boundaries. I've written and deleted the opening paragraph at least 20 times, trying to find the right tone, the right entry point into material that still feels raw even decades later. But now, with the pin my father gave me sitting on my desk beside the keyboard, with the memory of our lunch fresh in my mind, the words come easier. I write about the family day incident, about the humiliation I felt when my father dismissed my authority in front of my airmen. I write about the years of boundary violations that preceded it, the small cuts that accumulated into a wound I didn't realize I was carrying. I write about the Tarmac incident, about watching security lower the stairs to Air Force One while my father stood frozen, finally understanding the reality of my rank. But I also write about what came after. The slow rebuilding, the small gestures of respect, the conversations where we both had to let go of old patterns and create new ones. I write about forgiveness that wasn't instant or complete, but evolved over time into something resembling peace. I write about the pin, about what it means to receive a symbol of someone else's legacy, not as a burden, but as a gift freely given. And I write about transformation, about the fact that people can change even late in life, even after decades of being one way. My father changed because the Tarmac incident shattered his illusions so completely that he couldn't rebuild them. He had to face reality, had to accept that I'd become someone beyond his understanding and control. And in that acceptance, he found a way to be proud that didn't require diminishing me or claiming credit. The chapter pours out, 5,000 words written in a single sitting, barely stopping except to stretch my hands and refill my coffee. When I finish, I read through it once, surprised by how honest it is, how vulnerable. I've spent my career projecting strength and competence, maintaining professional distance, never letting anyone see the messy human underneath the uniform. But this is different. This is the truth of what I live through, presented without the polish or protection I usually insist on. I save the document and close my laptop, feeling simultaneously exhausted and lighter. The sun has set while I was writing, the room dark except for the desk lamp. I turn on the overhead light and notice the pin again, catching the glow, the tarnish giving it character rather than diminishing its value. On impulse, I pick up the phone and call my father's facility. The evening nurse answers, and I ask if he's still awake. He is, she confirms. Want me to transfer you to his room? Please. There's a pause, some clicking, and then his voice, slightly confused, because I don't usually call this late. Everything okay? Everything's fine, I assure him. I just wanted to tell you something. What's that? I used the pin. The one you gave me today. I was stuck on a chapter in my book, and looking at it helped me figure out what I wanted to say. There's silence for a moment, and I worry I've said something wrong, pushed too hard into sentimentality. But then he speaks, voice thick with emotion he's no longer afraid to show. I'm glad. That's what it's for. To remind you where you came from, even if where you went was somewhere I never could have imagined. It worked, I say softly. We talk for a few more minutes, nothing profound, just the comfort of connection. When we hang up, I realize I'm crying, quiet tears that have nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with gratitude. Gratitude that we both lived long enough to get here, to this place where our relationship works, where the past doesn't haunt us, where we can give each other gifts that mean something beyond their physical form. The next morning, I wake early out of habit, the decades of 0430 reveille still programmed into my body even though there's no formation to attend, no morning brief to prepare for. I make coffee and sit on my back porch, watching the sky lighten from deep purple to soft pink, listening to birds announce the new day with their territorial songs. This is my favorite time, the quiet before the world fully wakes, when I can think without interruption. I think about the panel Dana invited me to participate in, about what I'll say to a room full of service members who are probably struggling with some version of what I struggled with. Family expectations, complicated loyalties, the challenge of maintaining relationships when your career takes you places the people who raised you can't follow. The military doesn't prepare you for this part. They teach you how to lead airmen, how to manage operations, how to make decisions under pressure. But they don't teach you how to set boundaries with a parent who treats your rank as a tool for their ego. They don't teach you how to forgive someone who hurt you repeatedly, or how to rebuild trust after it's been shattered. They don't teach you how to recognize when love has become toxic, when loyalty has become self-sacrifice, when the relationship is costing you more than it's giving. I learned those lessons the hard way, through trial and error, through years of counseling and conversations with mentors who'd navigated similar terrain. I learned that you can love someone and still need distance from them. I learned that boundaries aren't punishments, they're preservation. I learned that some relationships can only survive if you're willing to let them break first, to clear away the dysfunction and see if there's anything healthy underneath worth rebuilding. Most importantly, I learned that transformation is possible, even when it seems impossible. Even when someone has spent decades being one way, they can change if the motivation is strong enough, if the consequences are real enough, if they're finally willing to do the hard work of honest self-examination. My father changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough that we could have a relationship that didn't hurt, that didn't require me to shrink or pretend or sacrifice pieces of myself to maintain his comfort. Enough that he could celebrate my achievements without needing to claim them. Enough that he could see me clearly and not be threatened by what he saw. And I changed too. I learned to stop seeking his approval as the measure of my worth. I learned to set boundaries calmly and maintain them consistently. I learned to distinguish between the obligation of family and the choice of relationship, understanding that I could fulfill the first without sacrificing myself to the second. I learned that strength isn't just about carrying weight, it's also about putting weight down when it's not yours to carry. The sun clears the horizon, full daylight now, and my phone buzzes with a message. It's from Alexis. Grandpa just called. Said you're writing about him in your book. He's excited. Also slightly terrified you'll make him look bad. I told him you'd be fair. You will be fair, right? I smile and text back, I'll tell the truth. That's the fairest thing I can do. Because that's what matters. Not protecting anyone's image, not softening the edges to make the story more palatable, but presenting the reality of what we lived through, the mistakes we made, the pain we caused each other, and the grace we eventually extended. The truth is complicated, but it's also redemptive. It shows that people can grow, that relationships can heal, that the patterns that seem permanent can actually be broken with enough courage and commitment. The rest of the day passes in comfortable routine. I work in the garden, pulling weeds and staking tomato plants that are threatening to topple under the weight of ripening fruit. I drive to the library and return the stack of books I've been reading, pick up new ones that caught my eye. I stop at the grocery store and buy ingredients for the dinner I'm making on Sunday when Alexis's family visits. Normal, mundane tasks that make up a life. But underneath the routine, I'm thinking about the panel, about my father, about the story I'm telling in my book and the larger story of how we became who we are. We're shaped by the people who raise us, for better and worse. We inherit their values, their fears, their unresolved issues. But we're not bound by those inheritances. We can examine them, keep what serves us, discard what doesn't, transform what remains into something healthier. My father gave me discipline and standards, a respect for aircraft and the people who serve. But he also gave me insecurity masked as pride, competition disguised as love, control presented as care. I kept the first set and worked hard to shed the second. And in doing so, I showed him that there was another way to be, another way to relate, another way to love that didn't require ownership or diminishment. That night, I call Dana back and tell her I'll need about 20 minutes for my portion of the panel. She laughs and says I'll have 15, but she'll see what she can do. We discuss the structure, the other panelists, the questions she's planning to ask. When we hang up, I feel a flutter of nervousness, but also anticipation. This matters. This work of sharing what I've learned, of helping others navigate challenges I struggled through alone, this is the legacy work of late life. The uniform is in my closet now, pressed and preserved, but no longer worn. The rank I spent decades earning is a title I carry but no longer actively use. But the lessons, the hard-won wisdom, the understanding of leadership and relationships and the complicated dance between them, that's still active, still relevant, still mine to share. Sunday arrives, and with it, my family. Alexis and her husband Marcus pull up with the kids, 7-year-old Emma and 4-year-old Jackson, both of whom explode out of the car with the kinetic energy only small children possess. Emma runs to show me a drawing she made at school, a colorful interpretation of an airplane that she says is like the ones you used to fly, Grandma. I don't correct her that I never actually piloted aircraft, that my career was in logistics and operations. The distinction doesn't matter to a 7-year-old, and honestly, it barely matters to me anymore. What matters is that she's proud, that she sees my career as something worth drawing pictures about, that she's growing up in a world where women in military leadership isn't unusual or surprising. We eat dinner around my dining room table, the one I bought after retirement specifically because it's big enough for family gatherings. The conversation flows easily, jumping from Marcus's work project to Emma's upcoming dance recital to Jackson's newfound obsession with dinosaurs. Alexis catches my eye at one point and smiles, a moment of shared understanding between us. She knows I'm working on the book. She knows I've been processing my relationship with her grandfather. She knows this work is important to me, and she supports it even though it means examining parts of our family history that aren't entirely comfortable. After dinner, while Marcus wrangles the kids through baths and bedtime stories, Alexis and I sit on the porch with glasses of wine, watching the sky darken and the first stars emerge. He really is excited about the book, she says, picking up the thread from her earlier text. I talked to him yesterday, and he kept asking what I thought you'd say, whether you'd include the story about Air Force One. I'm including everything, I tell her. The good and the bad. The years when we barely spoke and the years when we figured it out. She nods. That's important. People need to know it's not always easy, that sometimes the people you love the most are the hardest to have a relationship with. I look at her, this daughter who turned out so much better than I had any right to expect given how often I was deployed, how frequently I missed events, how much of her childhood happened while I was on the other side of the world. Did I mess you up? I ask, the question emerging before I can stop it. With all the moving, all the times I wasn't there, all the times military obligations came first? She's quiet for a moment, considering. You mess me up in some ways, she admits. I have a weird relationship with goodbyes. I struggle with putting down roots because we moved so much. I sometimes feel guilty asking for help because you always seemed so self-sufficient. I wince, but she's not finished. But you also gave me so much. You showed me what competence looks like, what leadership looks like, what it means to commit to something bigger than yourself. You taught me that women can do anything, be anything, command anything. You set boundaries and expected people to respect them. You didn't tolerate disrespect or diminishment. She reaches over and squeezes my hand. You weren't perfect, Mom. But you were good. And when you made mistakes, you owned them and tried to do better. That's more than a lot of people get. I feel tears prick my eyes for the second time in a week, this late-life softness still surprising me. Thank you, I manage. For what? For turning out so well despite my limitations. For giving me grace I probably didn't deserve. For letting me be your mother even when I wasn't always present. She smiles. You were present in the ways that mattered. And, honestly, watching you and Grandpa work through your stuff taught me a lot about relationships, about how they can heal if both people are willing to do the work. We sit in comfortable silence, sipping wine and listening to the sounds of Marcus trying to convince Jackson that dinosaurs are, in fact, extinct and cannot come to his birthday party. Eventually, Alexis goes inside to help with the bedtime chaos, and I'm left alone with my thoughts and the stars and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that despite everything, despite all the mistakes and missed moments and imperfect choices, somehow we all turned out okay. The panel takes place 3 weeks later in a conference room at a hotel near a major Air Force base. The audience is a mix of active duty and veterans, mostly officers, but with a good representation of senior enlisted. I sit at a table with 3 other panelists, a Marine colonel who navigated being the first in her family to go to college, let alone join the military. An Army lieutenant colonel who had to set boundaries with parents who kept trying to use his rank to resolve their personal disputes, and a Navy captain whose father was also Navy and struggled with his daughter outranking him. Dana moderates, keeping the conversation flowing, asking questions that draw out our experiences without turning it into a therapy session. When it's my turn to speak, I tell a condensed version of my story. I talk about growing up watching planes with my father, about his initial pride when I joined, about how that pride curdled into resentment and entitlement as I advanced in rank. I talk about the Family Day incident, about the moment he dismissed my authority in front of my airmen, and how that became a turning point. And then I talk about the Tarmac incident. The room goes completely silent as I describe my father walking toward Air Force One, the security response, the moment when the stairs lowered and the pilot saluted. I can see recognition in many faces, that specific understanding of what it means when someone finally grasps the reality of your authority. The thing about that moment, I say, is that it wasn't about proving anything to him. I didn't arrange it, didn't plan it. It just happened because I had the clearance and he didn't understand that I actually had the clearance. But it shattered his illusion completely. He couldn't pretend anymore that my rank was symbolic or that his experience working on aircraft somehow equaled my authority to command them. I pause, making sure I have their attention for the next part. But here's what matters more than that moment: what happened after. Because that moment could have just been a humiliation, an end to our relationship. Instead, it became a beginning. He started doing the hard work of understanding who I actually was instead of who he needed me to be. And I started doing the hard work of setting boundaries and maintaining them, of not sacrificing myself to maintain his comfort. I tell them about the years of rebuilding, about the small gestures and incremental changes, about how transformation happens slowly and imperfectly. I tell them about the pin he gave me, about what it meant to receive that symbol of his legacy without the weight of competition or resentment attached to it. 30 years later, I conclude, we have a relationship that works. It's not the relationship I imagined when I was young, but it's honest and respectful and good. He's 94 now, and I visit him twice a week, and we talk about real things without the tension that used to define every interaction. We got here because we both changed, because we both chose to do the hard work even when it would have been easier to just drift apart. During the Q&A session, the questions come fast and earnest. How do you set boundaries without feeling guilty? How do you know when a relationship is worth saving versus when it's healthier to walk away? How do you maintain your own identity and authority when family members are trying to claim it or diminish it? I answer as honestly as I can, drawing on my experience, but acknowledging that there's no universal formula. Every relationship is different. Every family dynamic has its own complications. But some principles hold true. Boundaries are necessary and healthy. Respect must go both ways. You can love someone and still need distance. Change is possible, but requires commitment from all parties. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in dysfunction. After the panel ends, several people approach me, wanting to share their own stories or ask follow-up questions. A young captain pulls me aside and says quietly, "My mother keeps introducing me as my daughter, the captain, like it's her achievement. It drives me crazy, but I don't know how to address it without hurting her." I spend 15 minutes talking her through strategies for gentle boundary setting, for acknowledging her mother's pride while redirecting the narrative. When I finally leave, Dana walks me to my car and says, "That was powerful. You should do more of these." Maybe I say, "It's strange, being this vulnerable in public. I spent my whole career maintaining professional distance." "That's exactly why it matters," Dana replies. "People need to see that even general officers struggled with this stuff, that having stars on your shoulders doesn't mean you had all the answers or navigated everything perfectly. It gives them permission to struggle too and to work through it." I drive home thinking about her words, about the strange trajectory of late life where the things you spent decades hiding become the things you need to share. The vulnerability I avoided during my career has become essential in retirement, a way to transform private struggle into public wisdom. When I get home, there's a message from the assisted living facility. "My father had a minor fall, nothing serious, but they wanted me to know." I call immediately, and the nurse assures me he's fine, just bruised his hip and his ego, refusing to use the walker they keep recommending. I ask to speak to him, and when he comes on the line, his voice is gruff with embarrassment. "I'm fine. They're overreacting." "I'm coming over," I tell him. "You don't need to, I'm coming over," I repeat, gentler but firm. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. When I arrive, he's sitting in his recliner with an ice pack on his hip, looking annoyed at the fuss. I pull up a chair and sit across from him, and we look at each other for a long moment before I speak. "You know you need to use the walker, right? That's not negotiable anymore." He starts to argue, then stops, something shifting in his expression. "I hate feeling weak. Using a walker isn't weak. It's smart. It keeps you mobile and independent longer. Refusing to use it because of pride? That's what limits you." He absorbs this, and I can see him working through the logic, the same straightforward practicality that used to define him before ego got in the way. "When did you get so bossy?" he asks, but he's almost smiling. "Around the time I made captain," I reply. "You just didn't notice for a while." He laughs, a short bark of amusement that turns into a wince as his hip protests. "I noticed. I just didn't like it." "I know. We sit together for an hour, talking about nothing important, just keeping each other company. I help him to the bathroom when he needs it, make sure he takes his evening medications, adjust the ice pack when it slips. Small acts of care that feel important precisely because they're small, because they're freely given without resentment or obligation. As I'm leaving, he catches my hand. How'd the panel go? The one Dana invited you to. It went well. I talked about us, about the Tarmac incident and everything after. He nods slowly. You tell them I changed? I told them we both changed. That it took work from both of us. Good, he says. That's the truth. I don't want people thinking I was some villain you had to overcome. I was just a person who didn't understand and had to learn. That's exactly how I presented it, I assure him. He squeezes my hand once, then lets go. I'm proud of you. I know I say that a lot now, but I mean it. Not because you're my daughter or because your success makes me look good. I'm proud because you're a good person who did important work and never compromised who you were, even when it would have been easier. I lean down and kiss his forehead. I learned from the best. Eventually. He laughs again, and I leave him there, settling back into his recliner with the remote control and a documentary about World War II aircraft queued up on his television. The drive home feels different, somehow lighter. I think about the arc of our relationship, the long journey from those evenings at the fence line to this moment, decades later, where we've both been humbled and elevated by time and experience and the hard work of honest connection. 30 years after the Tarmac incident, we're not the same people we were. He's smaller, softer, more willing to admit weakness. I'm retired, reflective, more willing to show vulnerability. But we're still here, still showing up for each other, still doing the work of relationship even when it's hard or inconvenient or pushes against old patterns. That night, I add another section to my book, writing about this visit, about the Walker conversation, about the way care flows both directions now. I write about how the relationship we have at the end of life is often more honest than the one we had at the beginning, how stripping away pretense and ego reveals what was always underneath if we were brave enough to look. And I write about gratitude. Gratitude that we both lived long enough to get here. Gratitude that the Tarmac incident happened when it did, providing a catalyst for change before it was too late. Gratitude for every conversation, every visit, every small moment of connection that builds into a life shared, if not always understood. The book is almost finished now. Just a few more chapters, a conclusion that ties together the threads of career and family, authority and love, the particular challenges of being a woman in military leadership while also being a daughter, a mother. A human being with needs and limitations and the desire to be seen clearly by the people who matter most. When it publishes next year, my father will get the first copy. I've already decided. It will sit on his shelf next to the photographs, a record of everything we've been through, everything we've survived, everything we've become. And maybe, somewhere, someone else will read it and recognize their own story, their own struggle, their own hope that transformation is possible even when it seems impossible. That connection, that offering of hard-won wisdom to strangers who need it, that's the final act of service. Not wearing the uniform, not commanding airmen, but sharing the truth of what I lived through so others might navigate their own challenges with more grace and less pain than I did. The stars on my shoulders are retired now, packed away in a display case my daughter gave me. But the lessons I learned while earning them, the wisdom gained through struggle and time, and the stubborn refusal to give up on relationships that mattered, that's still active duty. That's the legacy that matters most. And as I sit here, 66 years old, looking back on a life of service and forward to whatever years remain, I feel something close to peace. Not perfect peace. Not the absence of regret or the erasure of past pain. But the peace that comes from knowing you did the work, you showed up, you changed when change was needed, you forgave when forgiveness was possible, and you kept moving forward even when the path wasn't clear. My father and I got 30 more years after the Tarmac incident. 30 years to rebuild, to heal, to create something better than what we had before. Not everyone gets that chance. Not every relationship survives the breaking point. But ours did, and that matters. That's worth celebrating, worth documenting, worth sharing. That's the feel-good ending that took 3 decades to earn. Not a moment of triumph, not a single event that fixed everything, but the slow accumulation of better days, honest conversations, and the choice, made over and over again, to keep showing up for each other despite the complications. That's the real story. That's what I'll leave behind when I'm gone. And that's enough. That day on the tarmac didn't just change my relationship with my father, it changed how I carry myself as a daughter, an officer, and a woman who finally learned to enforce her own boundaries. If you've ever had to step back from someone you love to protect your peace, I'd love to hear how you handled it. Did they respect your line? Did the relationship survive the shift? Or did distance bring you clarity? Drop your story in the comments. Someone out there needs to hear it. And if this resonated with you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. There are more true stories coming about strength, self-respect, and the moments that shape us. Thanks for listening.